Welcome back to our stage.
Thank you very much. It's so great to be with you.
And now we can see a little bit of your heads. This is good. I wanted to start with a question. How did you experience the Vietnam War? I mean, I remember I was a college student at Queens College, and, you know, classes were canceled because everybody was protesting, but you.
I was a faculty brat, and we moved in the summer of 1963 to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where my father taught in the anthropology department, and where a little bit over a year and a half later, one of the first, if not the first, teach-ins took place. So I was on a campus, a hotbed of opposition. I had sort of been rudely awakened, as we were talking about in the green room, by the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy's assassination, and so Vietnam became, there wasn't a moment when I wasn't reading the paper, watching the news, and was aware of what was going on. And then, of course, by the time I was 18 years old, I was eligible for the draft and ended up having a very high draft number. But I recently found a kind of treasure trove of letters in support of a nascent and not yet submitted conscientious objector status request that I don't think would have happened. But I also think that the thing now in retrospect, after spending 10 years on this project, is that I went in thinking I knew a lot, and I realized that I knew almost nothing. That almost everything about the Vietnam War that we all had, wherever we came from, whatever the background, was mainly made up of some little tidbits of superficial information, conventional wisdom, baggage that we carried, and then, of course, we find ourselves in kind of hardened silos of argument, not fact, but argument, like if only this had happened, or I believe that this was. And it was so humiliating to work on this project for so long, having to completely lose all the things that you thought you knew in order to reconstruct it in a way that might make a more accurate sense and benefit from the last 42 years of scholarship, new openness with Vietnam, presidential tapes being mostly deciphered, lots of things like that that sort of aided our attempt to come to terms with it now.
And if you could select one or two things that you learned in the process of writing the book and making the film, what might that be?
Well, I remember being a kid watching a demonstration and hearing people chant, "Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, NLF is going to win." And that presupposed, I think, among everyone, that we knew who the leader of our enemy, the North Vietnamese, was, Ho Chi Minh, the great father of Vietnamese independence. But in point of fact, in 1959, and that's not a typo, 1959, he had already been marginalized on a very hardline Politburo. He was more moderate. And that there was another man named Le Duan who kind of carried the anger and frustration of Southern revolutionaries north and had become the dominant figure and was literally, by 64, when Ho abstained in an important vote on an ill-advised offensive that Le Duan wanted to do, and Ho didn't think it was correct, Ho was effectively sort of neutered on that Politburo. Beloved figure to his people and to the rest of the world, a figurehead of Vietnam, but it's really important to know who the guys are that you're fighting, and we found a tape, almost stumbled upon a tape. People assume they know the tapes. They haven't all been transcribed, or I'm not even sure all listened to, even by scholars over the last years. But we stumbled over a conversation between Mcnamara and Lyndon Johnson, where Mcnamara was sort of going on, and Johnson is barely paying attention, and said, you know, I talked to a British historian who said there's a hardliner on the Politburo. Saying a hardliner on the Politburo in Hanoi is like saying water's wet. And it was a guy, Le Duan, and he spells it L-E-D-U-A-N, which is pronounced Le Duan. And Johnson's like, and that's the first time, early 66, that a guy who's been in power for 7 years, the President of the United States hears his name, and he doesn't differentiate. He doesn't say, so that's the guy who's running things. He's still complaining about Ho in all subsequent tapes. So to me, there's a fundamental thing. And then, of course, there's all the quotidian little moments that you see, particularly when you study war, but I think when you study human activity in which there's contradiction and that there's more than one truth. And as Wynton Marsalis said to me in jazz, that a thing and the opposite of a thing can be true at the same time. And that's the thing that's the revelation. And it does kind of make you exhale, make you let go of your stuff. I mean, this has been a long, long journey. And I like to say that I lost my baggage on the first leg of the trip. It didn't show up at the carousel, and I ran out of baggage for the rest of the production. And that made it better for us, because Lynn and I could be umpires calling balls and strikes and not have a political axe to grind or an agenda, which is part of the role of documentary, of some documentaries, but is relatively superficial itself. It's kind of binary, a kind of good and bad, yes and no, red state, blue state kind of thing. And we wanted to touch a larger truth.
I also want to share with this audience something else that you said at the Telluride Film Festival in terms of what you learned making this film. You said, given how much the war cost, even just in terms of money, you said something like we should have given each North Vietnamese $600,000.
I think everybody in Vietnam, about 1965, before we put boots on the ground in March, I think if we'd gone around and paid every Vietnamese $600,000, every man, woman, and child, that is, make them junior capitalists, we would have gotten a better result than what we got. Or had we followed the Geneva Accords of 1954 after the defeat of the French at Dien Bien Phu and permitted elections to be held as the Geneva Accords required in 1956, 2 years later, which would have overwhelmingly elected Ho as the president of a unified Vietnam, we could have gotten to exactly where we are right now. A communist regime, a hugely important economic partner, and now an increasingly important strategic partner. And we'd have 58,000 Americans still alive and 3 million Vietnamese still alive.
Right. I mean, one of the most extraordinary things about both watching the series and reading the amazing book that has like 523 photographs and 12 maps is, even as it illuminates American history, American behavior, a current American soul, the equal time given to the Vietnamese. You can get a glimpse of it just from that 8-minute when you have a dissolve from an American soldier to a Vietnamese soldier, and then you see him today. Could you talk a little bit, because those interviews with the Vietnamese in the film are amazing. Was Lynn Novick, your co-director, the primary person interviewing the Vietnamese?
She ended up doing that. I had a medical reason why I couldn't go to Vietnam, but it's important with somebody of Lynn's caliber to also give her as much as she can do. She was an equal partner in this. But we, as I think the introduction shows, it's in many different parts. There's an kind of a hallucinatory kind of PTSD-like beginning. There's the section that follows Karl Marlantes, and then there's a kind of formal introduction with still black and white photographs in a film that is going to, at times, revert to those still black and white photographs, the DNA of what I do, because they become a way in which you can fix the most important ideas. The section of that hallucinatory thing ends with a parade in the United States. And then when we finish that introduction and segue into Bao Ninh, we see a parade in North Vietnam and see that both veterans aren't talking about the war. And so for us, when Americans have talked about the war in films good and bad, from good like Apocalypse Now to bad, well, we don't need to say ill of anybody, we talk only about ourselves.
Right.
And we never engage who our adversaries were, but perhaps equally important, who our allies were. I mean, for a while, there was another country on earth. This is the story of 3 countries, and then there were 2, and a country that lasted less than 20 years. And it's a very interesting story which we'd rather not get into. And we felt it would be easier to sort of fix our understanding of what actually happened. We care about facts. by triangulating the perspectives. And what was so interesting over the course, what accrues over the course of the film, I believe, is that the Vietnamese soldiers and civilians, the Viet Cong guerrillas, the South Vietnamese soldiers and civilians and diplomats and students and protesters, they begin to sound very much like their American counterparts. And you begin to feel, particularly with the North Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong and our Marine and Army guys who are at those horrible moments of war, that they're saying almost exactly the thing. Karl Marlantes will say, you know, we're not the dominant species on the planet because we're nice. And people like to complain that the military turns young men into killing machines. I would suggest that it's only finishing school. And then Win Nop, who's the kind of combination of David McCullough and some revered uncle who happened to have been a North Vietnamese grunt, said that he had been in the jungle, he had killed his first person, and it was incredibly traumatic, and then it wasn't, and you got used to it. And he says, only human beings kill when they're not hungry. And goes on, he says, I've been in the jungle where there are tigers, and tigers kill only when they're hungry. And you begin to realize that the onus comes back onto us. It goes back to the Frankel interpretation that Max Cleland distills, which is to live is to suffer, to survive is to find meaning in the suffering. And I think with something so ultimately, in a larger sense, irredeemable, that you can find in our extraordinary inhumanity to each other. We're a really miserable species. Pockets of kindness and love and generosity, of reciprocity, that are really touching and kind of makes the human experiment worth following through. You know, none of us are getting out of this alive, and it might be it would be forgivable if we were in a fetal position, but we're not. We write symphonies and we make babies and tend gardens, and these are hugely important things. And yet we're faced with, and I think war brings out, a side of us that is unpleasant to look at, but is surprising in the way that it also sometimes illuminates the best of us. And the only way you're going to get to that is by triangulating. It's having Shylock have a speech in the Rialto scene. Right. Do you know what I'm saying?
And in fact, I think we have to make sure everybody knows that this film, the series, has been translated into Vietnamese, and it has been streaming
hundreds of thousands of times. It was great. We had PBS maintains a website, and if you went to PBS, if you still go to pbs.org, it is available. This 18-hour, we spent months and months working on it. It's perfect translation. And their internet, unlike the Chinese, is not blocked by the government. And so it's owned by several oligarchs, and it got through. And they have never seen dead bodies of themselves. They have never heard of a defeat. And in fact, their victory is a singular thing of the capital P people. And yet we had asked, to their great surprise initially, their soldiers, what did you feel? What did you experience? Something that was intimate and personal, clearly obvious to us of a Western audience, the kinds of things we do. Who did you lose? What did you feel? What did you feel? What did you feel? And they responded. So they are now hearing not the kind of antiseptic, singular, glorious victory of the people, but in fact the individual stuff, the doubts, the admission of participation in atrocities equal to or greater than My Lai, and also a series of defeats which their press never once bothered to report.
Wow, wow. Now, the book. The historian Jeffrey C. Ward has written or co-written with you, principal scriptwriter for the Civil War, Baseball, The West, Jazz, The War, and he also wrote or co-wrote the companion books for 7 of these. Is the process for creating the book simultaneous with making the film? I mean, or does one come after the other?
The book trails a little bit, and it trails for really good and practical, and for Jeff, very humane reasons. Jeff is an extraordinary historian and a great writer, and it is the horrible fate of this writer to submit himself to a group of people who then cut everything down. I take the first draft of the script and I read it and I rewrite lots of stuff myself so that it can be a spoken thing. And I'm the narrator up until the last moment when we replace with Peter Coyote in this case. And then the process of editing is winnowing down. And, you know, remember Amadeus where there's too many notes. Sometimes you're taking out scenes. If you looked at our cutting room floor, it's not filled with bad scenes. It's actually wonderful scenes, which you've looked at, you go, you idiot, why didn't you leave that in? And I could go back and put it in and show you how it destabilized, as good as it was, an episode. And so what happens is these are all a million cuts for the writer. You know, it really is tough. And what we always say is that it can be in the book. And then the book permits him also to take scenes that are already written in a kind of abbreviated way, not because my kinds of films are abbreviated, but because the kind of writing a priori becomes that abbreviated, and then can expand them. And it gives Jeff the luxury to then sort of reinflate the original drafts and then some. And I think it becomes as difficult as this one was for him, cathartic, and replaces a lot of the loss of the understandable, I guess, in the film business, triage of making a film. I think it's to his credit. He and I have worked together for more than 35 years. He's an extraordinary writer, and the fact that he can put up with the kind of things that we do is a testament to his forbearance as well as a testament to his skill as a writer.
Well, for example, even in the little bit that we saw, the beautiful words that he wrote and that Peter Coyote speaks, they coexist with music.
That's right.
And heaven knows, music is so palpable, crucial in informing the movie. In fact, I think you have about 120 songs, if I'm not mistaken. Very
exactly.
much of the era, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and Pete Seeger singing Big Muddy, or Janis Joplin singing Somebody to Love, or especially Bob Dylan's Hard Rain Is Gonna Fall. So one question, I know you started to talk about this in Telluride, but did you have to pay music rights for a PBS series that has this much?
So there's 3 or 4 different musics. There's a soundtrack that we went and asked Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross of Nine Inch Nails to do, which they willingly did. And they told us we'd love to be a part of that collaboration, but we're not. We gave them sounds and showed them interviews, and very early on. We like to do our music first, not at the end. We don't want to add it to amplify emotions you hope are there. So they delivered nearly 3 hours of stuff, which is amazing. You hear a lot of it in the beginning. And then Yo-Yo Ma and the Silk Road Ensemble took some Vietnamese lullabies and folk songs that everybody north and south would have known and grown up on, and bent it in their extraordinary way. And we have a couple of other people, Dave Sierra and Doug Womble, that we've worked with. Doug was with Wynton Marsalis's orchestra, and Dave is just a composer who was the principal composer on the Roosevelt series. And they added some things. But we knew this had to also be a contemporary thing, and there's no way a documentary could afford 12, let alone 120. And so the first thing we did is we went to the Beatles and we said exactly what I just said. And we said, we need you to say yes to things they've never licensed ever. And if they did, we couldn't afford even 1. And they agreed to give us 6 at a Most Favored Nations. Bob Dylan did the same thing. The Rolling Stones did the same thing. And then, like the domino theory, everybody else fell into line. So Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young has never, ever licensed Ohio about the Kent State killings, ever. And they gave it to us. And we have 120 pieces of music. And I don't want to give it away because I am probably correct in presuming that not everyone here has spent 18 hours watching all of this, but I knew going in the music that I wanted. This was my music, and I knew what the last piece of music was, and we got it. The Beatles gave it to us, and in fact, we've heard back from a lot of them and how excited they were by seeing the film and the music organically used. And that's a hugely important thing. As we're saying, usually when you score a film, it's after the fact. And if you bake it in to the beginning, then it becomes an equal element, as it certainly has to be, You all know what it's like to turn down the soundtrack on a horror film. It's no longer scary. But we work, and have always done it this way, a little ass backwards, of doing the music when we begin editing. So we're not asking John Williams, not to pick on Steven Spielberg, we're not asking John Williams to give me exactly 53 seconds and 22 frames. We will take what we get, and then we will change our film, because music is the fastest art form there is. 2 notes, and it can produce an extraordinary emotion. And you have to be subservient. You have to submit to that power and just say, well, this is what it is. And so I've sometimes carved a phrase of a sentence down to fit a phrase of music, or lengthened it, artificially lengthened it, in order to fit the phrase of music, if that would help the kind of integration, the organic or authentic, whatever word you want to use, integration of that music and that voice and that image and that sound effect and all of the various elements that are going together.
Right. I'm reminded, for example, in episode 10, where we learn about how Maya Lin, as a very young person, won the competition to design the Vietnam War Memorial. And when you actually see the memorial and the reflection of faces against those 50,000 or so names, to hear Bridge Over Troubled Water, it's just, it makes the moment so much more emotionally resonant that, yeah.
Well, you know what? We live in a rational world. 1 and 1 always equals 2. And yet the thing that we want, the thing that brings us to the why, the thing that makes you do what you do, what makes me do what I do, what compels our faith, our art, our literature, other aspects of our life, is where we want the improbable calculus of 1 and 1 equaling 3. And that's what happened. It doesn't always happen. It doesn't always happen in the same place for the same people, say within a given film. But you're looking for that moment in which you are permitting. Leo Tolstoy said that art is the transfer of emotion from one person to the other. And I think we're not talking about sentimentality or nostalgia. We're talking about more complex, higher emotions. Our founders said they thought that actually people would be liberated to experience these higher emotions if they could govern themselves and not be enthralled to some master. And it's a kind of interesting intersection of politics and art and possibility and American life, which I think we spend so much of our time here trying to parse.
For sure. Now, in the clip we just saw, and I remember how excited I was when I first saw it, you call part 1 déjà vu, and about 2 minutes in, the particular cinematic strategy that you use is the rewind. We suddenly see soldiers moving backwards and the bombs going back up into planes, and a young girl, the famous image, running. She runs backwards. We then see de Gaulle literally walking it back. And I found this extraordinarily effective, because it made me think about how that's one of the things that art can do, especially cinema. It can take things back so that we could imagine a rewound universe for a moment, not only to cancel the terrible things that have happened, but to figure out how we got to here.
That's exactly right.
And I was wondering, could you talk a little about where that came from? Because I think I know the answer, and we're going to have a clip for it. But
so there are a lot of things. Déjà vu is that the first episode is almost all the kind of table setting, and you could see that there were literally, in that hour and a half, the shortest of the episodes, 100 things that happened to the French that would happen to the United States, that permitted me in later moments of episode 1 to actually treat those moments as kind of wormholes that throw you forward in 6 different places in episode 1 to introduce you to Americans that are saying and experiencing almost the exact same thing. You found out that the Vietnam-Indochina War for the French became very unpopular among the left, that longshoremen would pelt returning soldiers with stones, that it was called la guerre Sale, the dirty war, and then we just sort of throw ourselves into Chicago. And you hear a Vietnam veteran watching it on TV when he's on R&R and being sort of stunned by what happens, but lots of different things. But for me, what I said earlier about the humiliation of not knowing, it became important for us to try to say, forget everything. If Marlenta says, what happened, then you actually have to let go of some stuff. And that meant unpacking and then maybe repacking. So all of those images you just saw going backwards, all of them will be in the film going forward, but in a new, more complicated context. And that's the important word, complicated context, that doesn't always satisfy a clean and easy answer, a good and bad, a right and wrong kind of thing, but something that in which we felt we should have a neon sign in the editing room. It's complicated. And for me, it was very personal, and I had an experience. My mother had been sick with cancer from 2 to 11 and died when I was 11 years old, and I was alone with my brother and my father, and I remember one day listening to my father reading a book, because he laughed out loud all the time, and he would call me down, and he would read passages to me, and then I took it up and read the book afterwards, and it was a hugely seminal book. It was Slaughterhouse-Five by Vonnegut, and I was 15 or 16 years old, and I could see the profound effect it had on my dad. And as you know, it's about his experience in World War II as a prisoner of war, caught in Dresden, this beautiful city that had no military value, that was bombed, and more people were killed in Dresden by the American and British firebombing than were killed at Hiroshima. And that's the slaughterhouse. He happened to have been safe because he was in a storage locker. But it's really about Vietnam. And so, and it was written in that period, and so it resonates. Just as MASH about Korean doctors is also about Vietnam, so too is this. But I was struck by one passage, which I know Annette has prepared.
It happens to be in my book.
And so I was reading Annette's book a few weeks ago, loving every second of it, and I came across this and I couldn't believe it, because it was exactly, it was if, the Roberta Flack, she was reading my letters out loud. So I'm going to read my letter out loud. This is a passage from Slaughterhouse-Five. Its main character is a guy named Billy Pilgrim, who is unstuck in time. He's had all these experiences. He goes ahead to fantastical worlds on other planets, back in time and whatever, but living a kind of ordinary suburban life, unhappily so in his delusions, post-World War II, he watches movies. It was a movie about American bombers in World War II and the gallant men who flew them. Seen backwards by Billy, the story went like this. American planes full of holes and wounded men and corpses took off backwards from an airfield in England. Over France, a few German fighter planes flew at them backwards, sucked bullets and shell fragments from some of the planes and crewmen. They did the same for wrecked American bombers on the ground, and those planes flew up backwards to join the formation. The formation flew backwards over a German city that was in flames. The bombers opened their bomb bay doors, exerted a miraculous magnetism, which shrunk the fires, gathered them into cylindrical steel containers, and lifted the containers into the bellies of the planes. The containers were stored neatly in racks. The Germans below had miraculous devices of their own, which were long steel tubes. They used them to suck more fragments from the crewmen and planes. But there was still a few wounded Americans, though, and some of the bombers were in bad repair. Over France, though, German fighters came up again, made everything and everybody as good as new. When the bombers got back to their base, the steel cylinders were taken from the racks and shipped back to the United States of America, where factories were operating night and day, dismantling the cylinders, separating the dangerous contents into minerals. Touchingly, it was mainly women who did this work. The minerals were then shipped to specialists in remote areas. It was their business to put them into the ground, to hide them cleverly so they would never hurt anyone ever again.
Wow, wow.
And it is the cinematic power that you have to kind of reverse that and momentarily change things. You hesitate and you permit in that hesitation the possibility of the thing as it turned out either not happening or asking us in a new and emphatic way how they might not happen again.
Right. And that book was published in 1969. Now, the reason that I have that in my book is very simple. One of the greatest films I have ever seen in my life is Come and See. It was directed by Elem Klimov. It's a Russian film of 1985. And even though my book is primarily about how the openings of great movies prepare the viewer to watch the rest of the film, it was a case where I had to include in my book the last sequence of Come and See as well, because it was the first time I had come across this strategy of the rewind. In other words, if we could go back formally, in terms of the film style, and philosophically to the very beginning, what would happen? So we agreed that I would show a clip from the end of Come and See. Just very briefly, it's the story of Floria, who at the beginning of World War II, he's dying to be a Russian partisan, but he's about 13 years old. He manages to get the rifle that is a prerequisite to join the partisans, and even though only a few months pass from the beginning of the film to the end, you can see in the last sequence, it's the face of an old man. And this kid had never acted before, but what he sees as the Nazis destroy, essentially they did, by the way, destroy 625 villages in Belarusia, and Alex Adamovich, who co-wrote the screenplay, had been a teen partisan in Belarusia. So finally, at the very end of the movie, Flor gets to shoot his rifle. But you're going to see that it is a rather hollow victory that he is afforded, and the use of newsreel footage in this particular case is breathtaking. This is like not just bravura filmmaking, but it really questions a lot of things. Every time that he shoots, Flor, it's not just that we move back to an earlier period of time chronologically, but that each time it is rewound, ending on a portrait of baby Adolf Hitler. And the question of where does evil begin is raised in such a cinematic way. Now, you saw this film early on too, right?
No, I have never seen it. It's stunning to me to see that.
You have never seen the film
I've never
before?
seen it. I read about it in your book, and I went, "Oh my goodness!" And then the connection with the Vonnegut passage came, and it was that's unbelievable.
Oh, then I actually, for some reason, I thought that along the way you had seen it. I feel terrible to make Ken Burns see the very end of the film without having experienced the beginning.
No. I will now go see the film because it looks so amazing.
No, as you can imagine, it's just an example of what a filmmaker can do, especially in the editing process. And I'm guessing that for you, making the Vietnam War was at least 50% shaped in the editing room?
Oh, I would say with every film we've done, it would be an even much greater percentage. It is not enough to collect the images and the interviews and all of those things. It's really how they come together in the editing room. It's not a script in which you've used as a guide for shooting. It is something that is continually evolving. So the editing room is where these things are made.
Of course. I am reminded that at the Telluride Film Festival, there was a panel with Francis Coppola, Ken Burns, and Lynn Novick, his co-director. And one of the things that she said on the panel made me sit up like this, namely that essentially you began with the sound of Apocalypse Now.
Yeah.
And since that is also one of the films in my book, and I do believe that the opening sequence of Apocalypse Now is one of the great introductions that we have. But before we watch it, could you just elaborate a little bit about that? I know that even before episode 1 has a single image, we hear the whir of helicopters.
This is the iconic sound. This is the thing that produces the dread in people for whom the Vietnam War is still an open and festering wound. It is the iconic sound, and it's very interesting to think of it as sound as iconic. And with Vietnam, it's without a doubt. There are many other sounds that we gave to Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, but the first one we gave was the thump, thump, thump of the helicopter blades, and it's actually using some of the initial beds, as we call them, sound effects beds that Walter assembled for Apocalypse Now.
Walter Murch.
That we began to form the soundtrack for this. And then we went out and created, I mean, I live in rural New Hampshire, and we procured an M16 and an AK-47 and brought them out into the woods under police supervision and recorded their sounds and what it sounds like going into dirt and pumpkins and things like that, to just get it right. But at the beginning, at least, or in the beginning, if you are doing the genesis of Vietnam, it's the sound of a helicopter. And in the beginning, it's Francis's film. It's a completely different film. And Francis was so lovely that day because he had been so moved and was not in the best of health to make it up to the high mountains of Telluride, but he wanted to come and sort of honor what we had done. And of course, the rest of us were there to also try to honor what he had done. And he wasn't going to have it. He was more interested in moving it back to the documentary.
Yeah, he was, you know, when people would ask questions about Apocalypse Now, he kind of deflected everything and brought it all back to the Vietnam War. How many here have seen Apocalypse Now? Oh, okay, good. And I guess there are quite a few who have not, but we're going to show a clip from the beginning where you can see the amazing juxtaposition once again of music, in this case, The Doors. Jim Morrison's voice is a very important component of the opening of Apocalypse Now. Then you've got, visually speaking, superimpositions of different kinds. You have the soundtrack with the helicopters dominating, and you have an introduction to a film that will be, among other things, about the mystery of identity. Because Martin Sheen plays a character named Willard who, in the course of the film, has to go into the heart of darkness, to use the very title of the novella by Joseph Conrad, on which this is loosely based. And he will ultimately encounter Kurtz in the form of Marlon Brando, at which point a whole kind of questioning of human nature and human behavior will emerge. But this is an example of what I would call an opening that introduces you completely to how to read the rest of the film. Now, when did you first see Apocalypse Now?
Just the second it came out. And, you know, it's funny reading your book, which is so wonderful. I remember something my first wife and I would do as we began our not only our lives together, but as filmmakers together, that we always felt that the very first image told you almost everything about a film. Like we could, in that arrogance of when you're in your 20s and you know everything, but I was so much older then, I'm younger than that now. We would just we could tell a lot about a film by the very first image, you know, and we could look at each other where we were watching it, and it was a great thrill in that. And so this was a kind of thoughtful and analytical exploration of an extension of what that means. And so I remember all of that, and I think superimposition is the key word, because it's superimposition of sound, it's superimposition of image. It's, of course, things are upside down and they're turned around. You have you don't really see rotor blades from the helicopters, you hear them, but then you have the ceiling fan, and it is about identity. It's hardly about Vietnam. It's about who am I? It's a really unbelievable film.
And I have to admit that to this day, whenever I think Apocalypse Now, it's the singing of This Is the End. It's the Doors music.
And wait a second, that's at the beginning of a film. To have the very first words of a film say, "This is the end," is so unbelievable.
I know.
I remember sitting up straight and going, that was really gutsy. And I think you riff on that in your book very well.
Yeah, because Samuel Beckett, I think, was the one who, in one of his plays, had a line, "The end is in the beginning." And of course, that's a bit resonant for my book, for Apocalypse Now, and for what you...
And can I say, for everything we've ever done, there's something incredibly similar. I mean, we know it if we've ever written a turn paper in high school, you know, and what your teachers taught you about what the introduction should be and what the conclusion should be. So for us, quite often material of the intro is, if it's jettisoned, often ends up in the outro, or you think it would have a place there. And this has been true of every film that I've made. There's been stuff that has been the grist for that mill of the beginning that is also the end, and vice versa. And sometimes you will take something from the end and bring it up to the beginning. I was just working on a film the other day, and I had a quote towards the end of the outro, and I said, my God, that's where the film should be, but how it should start. But I couldn't have done that unless we'd made all this other stuff happen and constructed with all the scaffolding and false work necessary to begin to approach the structure of the film. And then in editing is not additive, as you would assume, but it's subtractive, right? And so this is how these things get made, by pulling away. This is, thousands of hours of film for Francis in this case. This is not an additive process, it's subtractive.
Yeah. And also, I think the use of rock and roll music, for us, Vietnam is inseparable from rock and roll of the late 60s, early 70s, and vice versa. Apocalypse Now has it. And I can't help but feel how the Vietnam War is still very much with us and part of popular culture, not only because of your extraordinary series, but both of us recently, separately, saw Steven Spielberg's new film, The Post. And it stars a superb Meryl Streep as Katharine Graham, the first female publisher, and it was the Washington Post, and Tom Hanks as Ben Bradley. And it begins in 1969 with rock music as you see Daniel Ellsberg's character on a patrol in Vietnam. And I couldn't help but feel the coherence between the beginning of your Vietnam War series and The Post. And from the very beginning of Spielberg's film, you understand that Daniel Ellsberg had been right there when Secretary of Defense Mcnamara said privately, we're losing the war, and then got off the plane and told the journalists, yep, we're winning. And that gave him the motive for leaking the Pentagon Papers, and that's how the rest of the film develops. Your episode 5 and 8, I think, have the same basic thing.
It's so wonderful. William Blake said you could find the world in a grain of sand. And I always think that in some ways, even when you're doing something really big, it's always about a lot more than what it is supposed to be about. But I'm also really thrilled when you see, I just saw The Post on Saturday night, that what is a few minutes across a couple of episodes, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes across a couple of episodes of our film is this, 2-hour Steven Spielberg film with Meryl Streep and Tom Hanks, which is, it's always good to start off if you've got those three there. It's hard to
May I remind the audience that in The Roosevelts, the voice of Eleanor was so magnificently incarnated by Meryl Streep. And last year, you came here with Defying the Nazis, the Sharps War, where the voice of Wait Still Sharp was Tom Hanks. Yeah. So you've worked with these people.
I've worked with these people, and I've just spent the weekend sort of going back and forth with both of them about how much I love the film, and we had a moment in the editing room of The Roosevelts where we had brought in scholars, which we do in every film at many junctures, not just once, but from the initial conception and after treatments and after scripts, just to get it right. And some of the scholars we might interview, most of them are behind the scenes and helping. And more true of Vietnam, because we didn't film any of those scholars, we only took their advice and their expertise. But at one point in The Roosevelts, I remember watching a screening where I had just recorded Meryl and put her in and worked her in from whatever temp voices we had, and it was stunning what she had done. And there were Roosevelt scholars who leaned in, going, "I have not heard that Eleanor in that bite," and then they suddenly realized, wait a second, that's not her. This is a letter. There is, of course, no tape recording of an intimate, love letter to, her girlfriend or to Franklin or to her children. But in fact, it was the genius of, we used to say, pay attention to her. She's going somewhere, And she is, one of the greatest human beings. And, I can't think of a better actor than Meryl Streep.
I agree. She's been a guest twice in Real Pieces, and we hope will return in the not-too-distant future. I know we don't have enough time to go through a whole slew of clips that we've prepared, but you and I seem to share a deep affection for the work of a particular filmmaker, and we kind of like the guy too, and that's Philip Kaufman.
Yeah, oh, I love
And
everything
I felt that
does.
at some point we should bring him into this, and it's a connection to Apocalypse Now, because the sound design of Apocalypse Now was done by Walter Murch, M-U-R-C-H, one of the greatest editors and sound designers in film history.
I think he got the very first sound design credit ever.
That's right. And The Conversation,
Yes.
he also did the sound and received an Oscar nomination. Well, he was also the editor for one of my favorite films, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. It's from exactly 30 years ago now. My goodness, 30 years. And Philip Kaufman took on a kind of defiant challenge. Everybody said that Milan Kundera's novel was unadaptable because the book, as some of you probably know, was filled with philosophical asides about mortality and eroticism, and the primary character really is the voice of the narrator. And how are you going to put that in a movie? Well, Philip Kaufman, who had already made such films as The Right Stuff and Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the 1978 version set in San Francisco, he and Jean-Claude Carrière wrote a beautiful script, although having read it many times, I can tell you that a lot of that was jettisoned because they focused on the heart of Kundera's work, which had to do, on the one hand, with eroticism and a love story among adults, 3 of them to be precise, one played by Daniel Day-Lewis in his first lead role as Tomáš, the Czech surgeon from Prague. It was the first English-speaking role for Juliette Binoche, playing Teresa, the waitress that he meets. It was the first English-speaking role for Lena Olin, the great Swedish actress playing Sabina. And the other aspect of the film that he developed was how Prague was invaded by the Soviets in 1968 and what it meant. What is the sort of degree of freedom that any individual can have when he loses the freedom of his country but maybe still retains the freedom of his body? Anything else you want to say as we watch the beginning?
I love Phil. I know it's been a great pleasure to know him, and he's been an incredible champion of the things that I've done. But I think a way to understand him is I think in many ways he is the most European of American directors. He's utterly American. If you've ever seen The Right Stuff, that's up there as one of the great American films by an American director. But his sensibilities are more keenly attuned to what we would consider European sensibilities. And if you really take that, there's a rawness and a freshness to us, but there is a kind of sophistication and elegance to a European, and Phil has that. He's incredibly thoughtful, incredibly passionate person with deep, deep emotional responses. And this is one of the great, great films. Yeah. One of the great films. I'm so glad. And let me, I've been walking around with Annette's book for weeks now, and it's all marked up and dog-eared and stuff. It's a really wonderful thing to consider the way in which we are led into the possibility of this improbable calculus that 1 and 1 could equal 3, and that certainly is all throughout The Unbearable Lightness of Being.
So you're about to see the opening, which has a very playful quality, and the music is entirely that of Leos Janáček, a composer who was Milan Kundera's favorite composer, and it was all existing music that Philip Kaufman was able to incorporate, which creates a very different emotional tonality than the rock and roll music we've been hearing so far.
It's just so amazing. Everything about this, the music, the first scene, and there's something particularly now sort of charged about the first line of dialogue. But then when you cut back through the smoky windows and see that there are also another set of willing voyeurs that sort of forgive us our sin of watching this, it's fantastic. And then I think, and you bring it up, I believe, in your book, there's, sex has become this sort of pendulum in the United States between prurience and puritanism. And the idea that you could have lovers laughing is so fantastic. It's just that there could be humor, that there would be, are you afraid of women? Of course. It's a wonderful, wonderful film. And if you haven't seen it, and everything that Phil has ever made is worthwhile.
I must say that maybe watching it just now, hearing that line in a workplace, yes, there is a little frisson of, oh, how politically uncorrect we get. On the other hand, this is one of the few motion pictures I know of in which voyeurism, the act of peeping, is not treated as something to be ashamed of or guilty for.
No.
We're so used to movies like Hitchcock's, the beginning of Psycho, where we know we're getting this privileged view of seeing sexual activity. And if you're Hitchcock, who was very Catholic and believed that we are born into a fallen world, there's going to be a price.
Right.
You will always pay a price for peeping.
For being in your bra in the opening shot.
Exactly. And I finally had to coin a term for unbearable lightness and the feeling I get from most of Kaufman's films, and that was erotic jocularity. Because I've never really seen movies in which people make love and laugh, exactly as you pointed out, as opposed to treating sex as something dark and furtive.
We're still in a kind of adolescent dialectic in most of American cinema, and it reflects the larger culture as well. So everything is a good or a bad, a yes or a no, the prurient and the Puritan, the sort of the greedy and the generous, and all of that sort of stuff. And I think the hallmark of civilization is not the blurring in a kind of amoral way, but a kind of understanding of the fact that these things can coexist, that the fear of a woman, for example, could be embodied in a person whose body is in constant physical relationship to women throughout this film. It's a wonderful new way and a liberating way to see it. In almost every way, the film, I love it. It's erotic, it's wonderful, but it's also incredibly powerful. And of course, it is dealing and negotiating with a larger, hugely important political moment for the Czechs that is about, it's existential in that way. Will this state exist? And it's all about the Prague Spring and its end.
And the first half of the film, the voyeurism is primarily of beautiful bodies making love, and there's a lot of tension for the wife of Tomáš, Juliette Binoche. She's very jealous that he remains a lover of other women. But the second half of the film, after Prague becomes a Soviet puppet thing, it becomes more the voyeurism of surveillance, where you become aware that everybody in the film is being watched, and it's not for pleasure, it's because of control. And Kaufman is brilliant the way that he develops that. And he would go on to make films like Henry and June and Quills, very much concerned with the way that the body functions, the way that it has to be listened to, and the way that governments can stifle freedom as well.
And if we had had so much time, we could have gone from Apocalypse Now to the opening of Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver, which is about eyes and mystery and darkness and flame and all of this sort of elemental stuff.
We have to open it up to audience questions, because I promised, but if we have time, maybe we'll end with the clip
but
from
you could
Taxi
also
Driver.
go from Unbearable Lightness of Being to Francis Ford Coppola's The Conversation, which is also about that, literally about the surveillance, but in a way that feels, to this moment, utterly modern. It's exactly what we're talking about. It's not so much microphones in the square and shotgun microphones and directional microphones and bugs as it is hacking and things like that now, but we would feel very much in the realm of the paranoia that The Conversation engenders.
Yeah, the Conversation from 1974 is another one that I consider one of the greatest ever made. It occupies a very important place in my book, and Coppola was 2/3 of the way through filming when the Watergate break-in took place. So it was capturing that moment, but it was also, as you're saying, presaging an entire contemporary reality of surveillance so pervasive that we can no longer assume that anything we do or say is private. Can I just also share with the audience what Philip Kaufman wrote to you about the Vietnam War? Philip Kaufman happens to be also such a loyal letter writer, email now writer. When he loves something, he tells you so.
And this is not the first letter I've received from Philip and his son Peter and his late wife Rose, and they've been very, very generous.
Well, I'm just going to read you 3 lines and then we'll take audience questions, but this does encapsulate much of what I feel. He wrote, "Thanks, Ken, for girding your loins, and armed with that weapon you've sharpened over the years, for bravely entering into that dark hole, that tunnel where pain, madness, and suffering lurk. To paraphrase Satchel Paige, thanks for getting us to look for what we've lost before it comes looking for us, before it's too late again. I was deeply moved by the dramatic storylines of your witnesses, your storytellers, your lost and found and lost again souls whose tales became yours." That is, for me, a beautiful summation response to the Vietnam War. We're going to raise the lights a little so that we can take at least a few questions. I see 2 gentlemen over there and 1 woman here and 1 gentleman there. Okay, I'll try to do this in order. Okay, that gentleman and then next to you. I'm sorry, just a little bit louder. A question about the economics of making the Vietnam War. Oh, well, I'm not sure we're going to have time. He says he's a minor league baseball player and wanted to know how baseball came about. Not sure we'll have time to deal with both, but could you?
Well, I would say that the most important thing to understand about the economics of the Vietnam War, and indeed any film I've made, of the 30-plus films I've made, is that they could have only been made in association with public broadcasting. I mean, the model is not a corporate one. The model is not one in the marketplace. PBS has one foot tentatively in the marketplace and the other proudly out. It cost $30 million. It took 10 years to make. It was raised by corporate, individual donations, foundations, and some government granting agencies like the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and that. Baseball was the thing I wanted to do after the Civil War. I thought it was the sequel to the Civil War series. Shelby Foote said in that if that the Civil War was the crossroads of our being. And I felt that if you wanted to know what we had become, rather than just follow the standard dictum that the history of the United States is the sequence of presidential administrations punctuated by wars, you could do no better than to follow baseball, which had insinuated itself in so many other ways, rather than a rather narrow, sometimes myopic political military narrative, and that you could get the exclusion of women, you could get labor, you could get management, you could get the nature of heroes and fools and villains and popular culture and advertising, and most of all, you could get race, because the first progress in civil rights after the Civil War, which is actually what that war was about, was April 15th, 1947, when Jack Roosevelt Robinson, the grandson of a slave, made his way to first base at Ebbets Field, and that was before Rosa Parks had refused to give up her seat, before people had staged demonstrations at lunch counters, before the military was integrated. It took place on the diamonds of our so-called national pastime. That's a big thing.
Yes?
As a young adult, as the Vietnam War unfolded, becoming more and more disenchanted as I was glued to the TV set every evening, I never heard anybody really discuss what would have happened if we, quote-unquote, had won the war, what that would have meant.
Yeah, well, it's very...
Sorry, I'll just repeat. Wondering in watching the Vietnam War as it unfolded when he was a young man, what might have happened had the United States won the Vietnam War?
Won the Vietnam War. So there's an inherent problem and then a baseball analogy. So after you finish World War II, or more importantly, after you enter a nuclear age by dropping the atomic bomb, you don't want to have the next war. It's called World War III. So a priori, you've almost invented the lack of the ability to have the end of a war, to win a war. Have you not? You'll fight limited wars. You'll fight proxy wars. They're entirely unsatisfactory because you're actually not engaging the main combatants. In this case, the Soviet Union and the Communist Chinese. In Vietnam, we were just there. We could have been anywhere or some other place. So you have had, since then, unsatisfactory results in all these engagements. With a few modest exceptions, you could say that Kosovo or Serbia perhaps represented something, the first Gulf War, whatever it is. But you fall into a trap also if you get into the idea of conjecture. What if the South had won the Civil War? Apparently, since Charlottesville, they have. What if the Nazis had won the Second War? Well, apparently, since Charlottesville, they have too. But it's sort of like, you know, if we'd only taken our pitcher out in the 6th inning, we would have won that game. You know, if we'd put that general, it's a big, huge thing among some Vietnam veterans, that if Creighton W. Abrams had been put in earlier and Westmoreland is kicked out earlier, we would have won the war. You have no way of knowing that. You can only report what actually happened. And so for us, it becomes an exquisitely difficult discipline to just adhere to what would happen. But I think in the larger question, I don't believe there is a winning of that war. And there never was. And it has to do with the very nature of why we were there. It was to avoid World War III by fighting limited or proxy wars.
The woman right here, and then gentleman right there. You've brought to us the majesties and the horrors of what is America.
Storytelling of the Vietnam War, for example. And I found it to be, and I do find it to be, illuminating and revelatory. And I thank you so much for that.
And first, thank you because it's so illuminating and revelatory.
And my question is, do you intend to explore, document, and film a subject beyond our shores?
Do you intend to film, to document a story beyond our shores?
You know, I don't know. It's almost in a way people expect me to sort of graduate and move to a feature film, and I don't consider these films some lower rung on some career ladder. At the same time, I am parochial enough, provincial enough to be an American filmmaker. If I were given 1,000 years to live, which I will not be given, I would never run out of topics in American history. But that's not to say that we aren't flirting with various topics that would not be American in the way you've asked, and thank you for your very kind comments about it. But right now, there's enough grist for the mill to keep us going.
And in fact, we're not going to have time to do this, but you told me backstage he's making a film on Muhammad Ali, he's making a film on Ernest Hemingway, and of course, just tell them quickly, the country music.
So I've just spent all day, and I'll spend all day tomorrow and the next 2 weeks recording narration, Peter Coyote again, for an 8-part, 16-plus hour film on the history of country music. And it's as revelatory in some ways as Vietnam is. At least people don't die. They die of a broken heart. Let's just put it that way.
Right there.
I found the interviewees very, very moving, every one of them. And I'm just wondering, how did you find them in particular? Or say like Bao Ninh, the blonde-headed fellow, the North Vietnamese. And also, when the writer first started writing this, did you meet with him about a kind of overall point of view? Did you disagree? And finally, did you enjoy firing the AK-47?
Okay, 3 questions. How did you find the interviewees who were so moving? Second, when you and Jeffrey C. Ward sat down, did you have an overall vision, and did you agree exactly on that vision? And the third was, did you prefer firing the AK-47 or?
So I'm a bit of a pacifist, and I didn't actually fire them. I let my excited, very excited editors and assistant editors and sound editors do that. Jeffrey Ward and I, it's a real collaboration. So this is with a team and across many, many years. It's not like you go to him, you put your coin in the slot, you pull it, and you get out the things. So there's not a question of a point of view. There's a question of making sure we got the facts right and the elegance with which you communicate it. And he's an extraordinary writer. And as I was indicating before, that he's also willing to submit to the process of how you make a film and how you translate the words on a page to a spoken idiom that's then accompanied by images. And this is a process. For a year of editing, we see nothing in front of us. We just hear it as a kind of radio play, if we will. We call it a blind assembly, and we do in something as big and as complicated as Vietnam, 2, sometimes 3 blind assemblies, where we're just listening to me, the narrator, at that point, reading the words and seeing the disjointed talking heads cut up in a million pieces that are then smoothed out by cutaways and other tricks of the trade when the film is finally released. Now, as to those talking heads, we interviewed almost 100 people. There's 79 in the final film. There are about 50 Americans and nearly 30 Vietnamese, and they represent talking to and pre-interviewing over 1,000 people. And it's just then deciding, and it's a pretty good ratio. The difference between how many interviews we shot and used had nothing to do with whether they were good or not, but whether the film went that way. You know, we had to make decisions. As you begin, you are collecting as wide as you can. And as I said earlier, it's subtractive, and inevitably there's a mercilessness to that triage, and people get lost. Not through any fault of their own, but through actually my fault. And in this case, Lynn's fault as well. But the final thing I want to say to your excellent set of questions is that when we do war, we're sort of obviously about conflict, and it's about the movement of armies and nations and things like that. But what's equally true, especially in war, is the wars and the movements and the conflicts within individuals. And so what's interesting about the people you meet, many of them are in process themselves. John Musgrave undergoes unbelievable transformations in the course of the 10 episodes, which we just sort of held on to and tried to follow. And to specifically answer your question about Bao Ninh, he is the first North Vietnamese regular soldier to write about the war in an intimate and personal way with a very celebrated novel called The Shadows of War, and is, I can't say a dissident as much as someone who has been a thorn in the side of the various regimes that he's managed to outlast. And the blonde hair is, of course, the whipped cream on top.
Yes.
How do you think that Hampshire College helped to shape your love of filmmaking?
So,
Are you a Hampshire College student?
I am a potential.
A potential.
oh,
okay.
well, you have now, by setting me up with that shot, you are in. I can get you in to Hampshire College, so you need to see me afterwards. So I do not recognize the person who arrived at Hampshire College in September of 1971 and the person who left in June of 1975. It literally rearranged all my molecules. I went in there thinking that I was going to be a feature filmmaker, something I had wanted to be since I was 12, and I had memorized huge swaths of Andrew Sarris's American cinema, the sort of Bible of auteurs, and there I met 2 remarkable human beings, 2 social documentary still photographers who also kind of made films, Jerome Liebling and his protege, Elaine Mays. They had both taught at Minnesota and had come to be in, Jerry particularly at the foundation of Hampshire College. And I remember walking into the office one day of Jerry when I first met him. He was a terribly terrifying and imposing figure, and I thought I would kind of show off because I had come armed with this sentence that Sarris had written about Nicholas Ray, the director of Rebel Without a Cause and Johnny Guitar. And it was Johnny Guitar in which the screenwriter Philip Jordan, and Sarris had written this sentence. You have to understand, I'm a high school student like you, trying to figure stuff out. And he says this amazing sentence. He goes, Jordan set out to attack McCarthyism, but Ray was too delirious to pay any heed as Freudian feminism and Marxist masochism prevailed over Pirandellan transcended polemics. So I sort of blurted this out in this sort of, look who I am kind of way. And Jerry got up from behind his desk in his office and went and took me by the elbow and took me out of his room and shut the door. And I stood there standing in the hallway contemplating suicide. And I swear to God, look it up. It's in the book. It's exactly that. And it was indecipherable. It could have been the runes for me. It was. I needed a Rosetta Stone. I thought, and he had politely told me I was just full of shit, and and the rest of my time, was fantastic. So Hampshire was a really great place. I can't imagine. I really don't think I would be here sitting before you if I hadn't gone to Hampshire.
Great. Okay, this is going to be the last question, simply because we have to sign books right over there.
Well, this is a question for Annette about the book. Annette, can you tell us how you came to the brilliant idea to focus on the opening of films as a way to...
Thank you. The question for me is how I came up with the idea of writing a book about how the openings of great movies prepare the viewers to watch the rest of the film. And quite simply, it's the way I've been teaching for quite a few decades, first at Yale and now at Columbia. I'm just convinced that the opening of any great motion picture tends to give you the keys in the first few minutes by which to unlock the rest of the film. And I have found it to be as true with the masterful movies of Ken Burns. It's true for nonfiction as well as fiction. And it always, for me, is a way to anchor us as viewers, not in, all right, I have some expectations that I want you to do. You have to let the film lead you. It's a way of being kind of humble and respectful by letting the opening set the terms for how you're going to watch the rest of the film. So I just kind of tried to find as many great movies that I could and organize them according to categories so that other people who love movies would have another way to appreciate them.
I can't begin to tell you how important this is. I mean, we have the cliche of, you don't get a second chance to make a first impression. And when you translate that to filmmaking, there's a kind of exquisite urgency to the opening moments that you have to, in some ways, ask people for that submission, and in some ways also take it from them, arrest them from the momentum that had brought them to that moment and deliver them into a new space. And it is a kind of sacred communion that takes place between the filmmaker. And the last thing I finish is the introduction. I mean, it's there, it's the first thing I work on, and it's there, and I'm also sometimes walking out trying to raise money for the film with a version of it, but it is the thing that gets the last bit of attention, where every single frame has to be just perfect. And I can't begin to tell you how many times I've looked at the introduction to Vietnam, and worked on it and made it better. And still today I was kind of kvetching backstage to myself about how the ricochet off the tin can, the helmet in the very, very first shot that you see, it could have been a few frames earlier. That the effect is. Can I just tell you a secret? That with the exception of when you see Westmoreland talking, all the footage we get of Vietnam is completely silent. And so in the Tet Offensive, our 6th episode, we have upwards, and I think Walter would be proud perhaps, upwards of 160 separate soundtracks to make any given moment come alive in that moment. So no bullet ricocheted off that helmet that I know of, because I didn't have any sound with that footage. But we spent a long time building all of those things, or the concussive jolt of the third shot as they crouch in anticipation of the fourth shot with an explosion deep in the distance.
There will be opportunity for you to continue asking Ken Burns and me questions because we're about to go sign books. For the moment, I just want to say how grateful I am to Ken Burns for sharing tonight with us.